DCFS, we're a part of the county government. There are about 39 agencies. In America, the child welfare program is normally administered by a state agency. So where I came from and retired from, it was a state agency that did everything. In California, there's a state agency that sets the policy and the budget, but all of the activities are done by a county department. So we're the county department of Children and Family Services. We have about 36,000 children today for whom we have responsibility. 10 or 15 years ago, that number was doubled. And for those of you who are not intimately involved with child welfare, what that means is that we have the responsibility, along with a number of other entities, of trying to keep children safe. So we have about 7,500 workers who help try to keep those children safe that we're talking about, those 36,000. We have a budget of about $2 billion. This agency was formed about 30 years ago when the Department of Public Social Services split off and there was a creation of the Department of Children and Family Services. The goal was to have more priority put on children. So the majority of our workers are actual social workers, many of them MSWs. And an average day might consist of a call coming in, and we have 24/7 operation where we have operators who take calls from people like you or your parents or neighbors who say there's a child in danger. And we have about 220,000 calls a year that come in. About 150,000 of those get responded to, so one of our workers goes out, sometimes in the middle of the night, knocks on a door, not knowing who is on the other side, and tries to determine whether that child is safe. This is one of the most challenging departments in Los Angeles County and in America. We perform pretty well compared to other jurisdictions. Our counterpart is New York City. It has about the same number of kids, about the same number of workers, and child fatalities are always an issue, whether it's in New York City or Florida or any large jurisdiction. There are a number of different entities that have helped us over the last few years, last 30 years, and I've only been with the department for about 3. So over the last 30 years, we've had about 800 recommendations that have been made to improve our practice and service. About 90% of those have been either implemented or we found out that there is no legal way to implement those. So I really do appreciate the Blue Ribbon Commission coming in, taking another look at what we're doing. We always want to have people help us, and this person here is certainly one of those. So I'm going to turn that over to her.
From the beginning, the Blue Ribbon Commission, the supervisors, there was a tension between the Blue Ribbon Commission and the supervisors. 3 of the supervisors sort of had, including mine, had a skepticism about this board. First, they felt that there were 900 other recommendations sitting there, so what were we going to do different from what every other commission had done? And second, there was a concern that there's a distrust among the supervisors, and there certainly was at that point. There's been an election, so I think new blood has brought maybe renewed trust, but there was a fear that we were being created somehow to try to get rid of DCFS or change it in some way. And the fact is, we ended up looking at this system pretty differently, although our recommendations were certainly not revolutionary. I think most revolutionary of the Blue Ribbon Commission recommendations was trying to look at the county holistically, trying to say this is not, the well-being of children in the county is not uniquely the purview of the Department of Children and Family Services, although that certainly, they certainly bear the brunt of a lot of policy in that area, but they need the cooperation and collaboration of a lot of other departments, including public health, health services, education, probation, the courts, law enforcement. And our point of view was that all of these departments work in silos. They don't have as strong communication as they should have. They don't join in, they don't joint strategically plan or budget in a way that leverages all the talent and resources that are there for the benefit of children. And when something bad happens to a child in foster care, everyone just sort of points their fingers to everyone else. No one says, okay, a child dies in foster care, and no one says, ultimately the buck stops with me. Everyone looks somewhere else. So first and foremost, we thought, who in the county is responsible for the well-being of the child as a whole? Who could get in there and help facilitate that coordination? So we recommended that an Office of Child Protection be created with a director hired to at least nominally be in charge of the child as a whole, and to be able to first and foremost alert the media, alert the supervisors when a problem exists. We also pretty specifically came up with a few key recommendations for each department. Rather than putting the brunt on any one individual or entity, we made recommendations as wide-ranging as, let me preface this by, the supervisors kept saying, prioritize your recommendations. And we kept saying, there's no need to prioritize because the recommendations are specifically designed 2 or 3 for each department. So how do you prioritize having law enforcement, having funding go to law enforcement, to an eSCARS program that better technologically connects law enforcement to talk with each other and schools? How does that get prioritized against children having a right, foster children who are doing well in a school, to not have to change schools mid-year, to have the right to be able to, if they're doing well in their school, stay in their school and have the transportation be geared toward their needs rather than the other way around, to having the supervisors create a mission statement that declares children are a top priority and that they send that signal to other departments. They're not equal things. They're not things that have to be done in sequential order. Everyone could be doing their part at the same time, was the view of the Blue Ribbon Commission. And I guess finally, because I want to leave time for your questions, one of the things that the Blue Ribbon Commission did is we said, why have and one very specific recommendation the Blue Ribbon Commission had, in because it ties into something that Director Browning said, is that we recommended, because children tend to do better when they are with relatives, we recommended that pressure be brought to bear and focus on attaining more equitable funding for relative caregivers, because at the moment relatives are not funded the same as non-relatives, and so you have a lot of grandparents and older relatives taking care of foster children and deciding whether they want lights on in their home or putting shoes on the feet of a grandchild maybe, or a relative that they had not planned on having to be parenting at this stage in their lives. And that has made, there has been from the state, and Philip has put a lot of effort into getting our county to side on to a state initiative that will help equalize funding. But uniquely, we said, why have many very good recommendations not been implemented in the past? And one of the things that we found is that a lot of times a commission such as ours writes a report, and then that report just sort of sits on a shelf. And we recommended that this county do what has happened in some other cities, which is that we create a transition team to oversee the implementation of the recommendations. And so the supervisors appointed a transition team, which I'm a part of now, where we got in there, rolled up our sleeves, started to, by way of meetings twice a month, called in various departments and wanted to just hear what is being done and what is getting in the way of you implementing the recommendations that relate to you, so that we could do whatever we could in terms of talking to the supervisors, talking to county people where we could, talking to the media, keep pressure on the implementation. Our role was just to sort of monitor and facilitate where we could, in terms of, you have 9 people who have, many of whom have very full day jobs also, but in a community service sort of role to help monitor and facilitate at least until a director of Office of Child Protection was put in place. Now, to our surprise, one thing we had not anticipated in the Blue Ribbon Commission report is the supervisors did not find that person in their first go-around of a search. So now they have started a second search, but they hired an interim Office of Child Protection Director, which we are very happy about because she, Thesia Davenport, is very focused on continuing to implement recommendations, but that sort of leaves the transition team in a bit of limbo because we need to make a decision as to whether we should continue to operate sort of with an interim director in place or not, and that will probably turn out to be a lively discussion. So that's where we're at right this minute.
Director Browning, you had a big agency, right? 7,500 people, $1.5 billion budget, something like that. So, and now there's this talk of creating this Office of Child Protection. How do you envision yourself working with that? You know, is there any conflict there? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think communication is the biggest challenge we have in LA County today. As Leslie said, there's so many departments who have a mission and a mandate from the state, the federal, and the county governments. And so without some coordination, some communication, better than what we've had, I think we won't get the results that we really want. I think that this new Office of Child Protection, that's a critical office, which I think whoever's in that office can have a lot of access to the Board of Supervisors and also can influence publicly the discussion about priorities. Money is always a priority. There's no doubt there's never enough money to hire as many staff as we want. Our caseloads are high, much higher than we would like. We've added about 800 social workers, but that's not nearly enough. And part of what I think that office can do is just highlight the need for communication, coordination, and for people working together so that we can have a better outcome.
We have this new interim director of the Office of Child Protection, and you talked a lot about breaking down silos. In maybe 6 months' time, whether we still have the interim director or a new permanent director, how will you guys judge to see if that person is doing a good job? Like, how will you measure whether these silos are actually being broken down and there's increased coordination?
Well, I think that's a great question, and that was one of the points made in the report. I mean, I think the question I would ask you, or the whatever $100,000 question, is who's the we in terms of analyzing the success. I would say when you say how would you measure success of the interim person, I would say how would the supervisors, because that person would report to the supervisors, but the supervisors hasn't clarified. Maybe it would be how would the CEO analyze effectiveness. That's not entirely clear yet either, but I would hope that the supervisors would analyze effectiveness by, is there a process, has a process been put in place, for example, for where joint strategic planning takes place, where joint budgeting takes place. There also needs to be just markers of success. At some point, success will be judged by, are there more children who are there more children with successful outcomes every step along the way? So has a prevention plan been put in place, for example, so that there are fewer instances of abuse and neglect to begin with? Are there fewer instances of children, once they're placed in a setting, being moved from settings? Are there greater instances of reunification of families and where a child is not removed again from that family so that you know that there's been help brought to the family? Or every step along the way, which I would ultimately judge by fewer child fatalities and more foster children graduating from high school, going on to college, not winding up homeless, sick, unhealthy, not winding up re-abusing children, all of those, what are those markers going to be of success?
For Leslie, in the Blue Ribbon Commission, one of the recommendations was adopting Eckerd's model for predictive data and analytics for finding out which children are at risk the most. And then DCFS, you also developed the Aura system for doing something along those lines. And I wanted to ask about the level of receptiveness to this idea and how close LA County is to adopting one or both of these models.
Sure.
Well, I would just say that the Blue Ribbon Commission was, we were very impressed by what we learned of predictive analytics and their, the success of it, and a report, we're about to hear a report that you're familiar with, I'm sure, just released by people from USC, talking about predictive analytics and their importance. So we are, by Jacqueline McCloskey and Dr. Emily Putnam-Hornstein, who presented to our Blue Ribbon Commission. So we are, again, supportive of a plan that takes into account assessing children at highest risk and preparing in advance for those children. So one of the things we recommended along those lines was that a countywide cross-department prevention plan be put in place that takes into account the factors, you know, that make children most at risk. Obviously, some of those things, you know, you're always dealing, when you deal with something like predictive analytics, with other constitutional rights sort of situations where you can't say, you know, just because someone is poor, just because someone has a parent who was abused and neglected, just because, you know, you can't say that therefore, you know, people can't be looked at as definitively being abused and neglected because they are, you know, because they are at risk. But what we did here was that in counties where they use the Eckerd model, in counties where predictive analytics have been taken seriously, child fatalities were almost eliminated. And so that obviously seems very important for us to adopt our own model of predictive analytics.
Well, and we currently have a risk assessment tool that's built into every worker's daily activities, where they put in certain factors about the individual and the family and the situation that gives them a high risk, a low risk. That's one sort of tool that's being used nationally. When I first came in, I went and got a demonstration. It's a manual process. I was really very disappointed at the ability of a worker to manipulate that any way they wanted to, or just because they couldn't remember whether the drug of choice was heroin or marijuana, which really changes the scoring because they have to look through and manually pull out this data and put it into a little system. So I asked Casey Foundation and a couple of other organizations, find a tool that works in America, because I had just come on board. Nobody had anything. Nobody still has anything other than this SDM. I've looked at the Eckerd model, and there are some things that are common sense, that a child under 1 is probably at more risk than any other child. Children under 5 are probably at more risk than teenagers. Families where they have had multiple drug use or history of violence, those are situations where we need to put more priority. But we couldn't find anything in America that was being used that we thought was very good, and so we contracted for a pilot with the SAS Corporation. Some of you may know about FICO scores. Anybody in here know what your FICO score is? Okay, you do. All right. So that's a tool used by lenders and bankers. If you want to get a mortgage, you got to know what your FICO score is. So we contracted with SAS. They've done a pilot for us and looked at all sorts of factors. We haven't come to a decision about whether that's a good tool or not. There's a The only other place that I know where they're testing this is in Florida, but not with this Eckerd Corporation. This is with another group. So my hope is we can come up with a risk assessment tool that would be something that could assist a social worker, but that can't make the decision for the social worker. The three most important things that I tell staff every day are common sense, critical thinking, and accountability. Common sense is pretty rare these days, guys. And so if all of our workers use common sense and critical thinking, I think we would be a much better organization. But you've been doing a lot of research to know about this aura, because that's not something that's commonly known. Even though we've been doing it, it's still in a test situation.
So what about the moral, the moral question around that? Because this is something, there's certain Orwellian overtones when you're talking about before the referral comes in. It could be a great tool for allocating resources in a resource-constrained environment, but there are, there's some serious implications. This is not a DCFS question.
No.
This is before you guys even get in the picture at all. So I'm just wondering, as people talk about this more, what are you guys thinking about that?
Well, we ran this demonstration tool through all of our 36,000 cases. Assuming it worked, and we're not 100% confident it did, but if it does, what it showed was that there were, out of our 36,000, there were 11,000 cases that would be a high priority. 11,000 cases that were probably of low priority. So if I'm a worker and I have 30 cases and this tool says that these 10 cases, the likelihood of something bad happening is greater than the other, it gives you a sense of where you should put your time. That there's an ethical question now about whether or not you should be using some sort of a tool. Now this tool, the test was based on pulling data from health department, mental health, public health, law enforcement, de-identified data to test out this concept. And so we, in a real-time environment, don't have access to all of those data sources. And this is just LA County we're talking about. So we were trying to prove or have a proof of concept that would say, taking all of these information factors into consideration, this is the case that you ought to be putting most of your priority on. If you have limited time in the day and can only look at 2 cases, which 2 should you put your time on?
Right, and I think, this is all, these issues are so complicated. I would be interested in hearing 2 more sentences from you about what you don't like about the Eckerd model, but I would say this is complicated because one of the things that the Blue Ribbon Commission focused on, because we were put in place specifically with a child death, is to talk about childhood fatalities. So if you're looking at predictive analytics and you know that the children most likely to die in the system are children under 1 and then children under 5, that does help gear certain types of resources to children at that level. But that doesn't mean that other issues such as depression wouldn't be things that you need to focus on in a very innovative and focused way for teenagers. That there are, so it's one thing if your predictive analytics is just to focus on fatality. And that takes you to one set of resources in the county. But if another predictive analytics is to predict best outcome or children reaching their potential, it might lead to a whole other set of decisions. So it almost depends what sort of lens you're looking at, what you want to predict.
So in the Blue Ribbon report, there were focus groups that were conducted, and reading through some of the responses, there was a lot of positive and negative, and one of the most common negative was that birth parents didn't know about their rights within the system, so like the right to receive services, for example. I was wondering if there's been any recommendations or progress on that since that report was done?
One thing I want to say is that when we talk about child fatalities, often people think about fatalities occurring in a licensed foster home, an agency foster home, or a group home. Almost all of our fatalities occur in the parent's home. And so that's one of the real challenges we have. And over the last 5 or 6 years, more children have come out of these placements and they're staying with their parents. So the number of children who are staying with their parents has grown by 40 or 45%. But that's where the majority of child fatalities occur. Now, and frankly, child fatalities are pretty rare in the scheme of things. It's not like an everyday event by any means. They're many more than we would ever like, and they're all tragic. So our challenge is to ensure that if we allow a child to stay with their parents, that we've got enough wraparound services to ensure that nothing happens to that child. And that's where I think social workers are really concerned, that oftentimes they will never be 24 hours a day in a parent's home to watch out for that child. And so I think we have to do as much as we can to ensure the safety of the child. And frankly, there's a dilemma about whether taking a child is best or leaving it with a parent is the best. There are two schools of thought, and there have been public debates, and I've been in the newspaper with the judge. The judge says you're taking too many, and I'm saying, yeah, but your name's not on the front page of the LA Times when something happens. So you don't ever see the judge's name on the front page of the LA Times, but you've seen DCFS there all the time. So it's a balancing act, there's no doubt.
Those findings are indisputable that most of the child fatalities occur at home, and that's where the Blue Ribbon Commission immediately set out to sort of clarify that we saw our role as being more expansive than only keeping children alive, because there are one set of issues when a child is with a birth mother or in a home and there's a report, phone call, social worker goes out to investigate whether an infant is safe in a home, but then there are a whole other set of our only worry once a child is removed from the home is not only whether the child will remain alive, but whether the child will be able to flourish and reach their potential even if they're not able to be reunited with a birth mother. And so I started out in our first Blue Ribbon Commission meeting saying, we don't even need to meet if the whole goal is just to keep children alive. We could build facilities and lock kids in for 18 years and they will come out alive because the instructions to the caregivers will be to feed them and keep children alive. But how do we bring children, once children are out of the home, what can we do as a community to help children reach their potential, even if they grow up as foster children? And that was a lot of our recommendations went not only to preventing fatalities, but to keeping children healthy over those 18 or 21 years.
It seems like every conversation that we have with other people, it's about this heavy caseload and with social workers being overworked, etc. So what have you guys talked about in addressing the quality issues and what have you?
Some things already have been done even since the time the Blue Ribbon Commission met, but our focus was certainly on reducing caseload, although we did not we mentioned that in our report. We didn't want to put a big focus on that in our report because we didn't want the politics of just money to get in the way of people saying this is a pie-in-the-sky group. But certainly we endorse in every way, and already changes have been made. To some extent, new social workers have been hired, so that we think that's very important. And then we also emphasize just better training and a better division of social workers in terms of more social workers being on the front line, sort of doing the work that is so stressful and time intensive, and also a better distribution of social workers among, throughout the county, because the county's a huge place and some offices and territories are much more fully staffed.
So we have hired 800 new workers. The board has given us funding to hire more workers. The caseloads are dropping. They were in the mid-30s, and they're down now to about 27 in our what's called continuing service, and in our emergency response they're down to 17. That's still way too high, there's no doubt about it. We've automated a number of things that should allow the worker to have more time with the children, but caseloads are critical, there's no doubt about it. This is a tough job. I would suggest no one come into this If you think it's easy, if you think it's sitting across the desk and doing clinical counseling, this ain't the job for you. The people who do best are creative and innovative, and it's almost like the Marines, is that it's the tip of the spear that people, some of the people are so excited about what they're doing, but it is a challenging assignment as we have an intern over here who I had talked to, Sherry earlier was saying how exciting some of her days were. But it is very rewarding. A social worker can make a difference in the life of a child like no other person.
The county is a strange structure with 5 supervisors, and I'm still not yet convinced that they can see beyond their districts, beyond their silos, to work together for a greater whole. And I think when they can do that, when they can model that one county, we have an interest greater than our one of 5 districts, I think that will bode better for trickle all the way down to the most fragile children. So I'm hopeful because I'm an optimist. I think some of the best people in the county are focused on this issue every step along the way, from county people to volunteers, to some of the supervisors. Great people, some brilliant minds, some brilliant doctors, some brilliant educators, child welfare people are all focused on this. So that's good, but I think really I want to see the change. It really has to start at the top, and I think that's a question that remains to be seen.
I think progress is being made. This journey is a marathon, not a sprint. There have been 17 directors in the last 30 years. If this were simple, it would have been solved. You've probably seen this, but Lisa Ling did a story on LA DCFS, which I was surprised the Oprah Network would spend 4 months touring our offices, which had a very balanced approach. I think our social workers deal with some of the most challenging situations in America. They put their lives on the line. Excuse me. That is a unrewarded job in terms of compensation or praise or recognition, but they make a difference.